Welcome. We are here at Funding the Commons and Earth Commons, part of Funding the Public Goods Lab Week, brought to you by Protocol Labs. Thanks for tuning in. We have an epic lineup of guests on this one. Alan Ransil from Filecoin Green, Holke Brammer from Hypercerts Foundation, and Djimo Serodio from Silvi.earth. Thank you, guys. We're talking about how to plant 1 trillion trees, verify it, store it on the blockchain. Very excited for this discussion. Djimo, why don't you begin? You gave a talk this morning about this idea of planting 1 trillion trees. Tell us more.
Yeah, so we basically had 6 trillion trees before the Industrial Revolution. We've lost half of them, and there's a clear path to recovering about 1 trillion. Sort of the World Economic Forum has mandated the 1 trillion tree project, which can be reflected in the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Sort of the executive orders of the White House around bringing natural assets to the balance sheet. And I think policy will catch up to this. It's, of course, reflected in the voluntary and the compliance markets, but basically, without verifying said work, I think there's potentially continued controversy behind the carbon markets and even the biodiversity markets. So, yeah, it's a big undertaking.
Can I actually ask, Djimo, when you say there's a clear path to recovering 1 trillion trees, like what does that like mean on the ground, like in terms of like geography and like action that people are taking?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of research by the Crowther Lab in ETH Zurich in Switzerland, and even sort of One Earth is prioritizing these impact zones. But it effectively comes down to expanding forests, transitioning agriculture, and a combination of indigenous restoration as well as sort of optimized agroecology. So we can't quite recover 3 trillion, but there's certainly room for 1.
It's just like when you look at like land use and like areas that are like degraded or like marginal land or something where you could actually like imagine an economic path to planting those trees. That's like what it comes out to is about 1 trillion.
Economic for sure, but we will not reverse anthropogenic biodiversity collapse without recreating that fabric of life.
And so maybe just at a high level, what is Silvi.earth?
So Silvi's a reforestation protocol, and we are tokenizing all types of tree actions and tree knowledge and methodologies. We're basically building financial and coordination systems and tools to support this initiative. And our long-term vision really is that trees are an ideal asset class for natural capital. And sort of, we have more gold in the universe than we have biomass, and so we take it for granted. But from an aspect of scarcity and utility, trees are not only symbolic, but I think actually would be, in theory, very effective. Pegging to the global financial system.
100%. Yeah. And Alan, you've been involved in this kind of Venn diagram between the sustainability space and the blockchain space for some time through Filecoin Green. Can you talk more about that and also how you see this conversation weaving?
Yeah. So we've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about how trust flows through society, right? And ends up allocating capital toward these types of projects. And a lot of this is being inspired both by the fact that blockchains and Web3 give us a lot of tools for verifying certain types of things on one hand. So we have a set of sort of solutions in our toolkit. And on the other hand, there have been all of these problems in especially carbon markets, but also people, questioning about renewable energy credits and all these things. So examples of that are the Kariba project, one of the largest carbon offset projects in the world, like turned out to have a lot of bad accounting behind it. People have been questioning whether rainforest offsets or tropical forest REDD+ credits actually do the work that they're trying to do. And more recently, cook stoves have come under a lot of fire. And so there are all these stories on people sort of misplacing trust in a lot of these systems. And we have a lot of tools in Web3 for verifying stuff about Web3 and for verifying stuff about markets, right? So you want to kind of reach and like say, okay, these tools can like plug into natural capital markets and like maybe that'll work really well. But when the rubber hits the road, there are a lot of gaps that we see people have to sort of rebuild solutions to fill those gaps, right? So we have great tools in Web3 for verifying like ownership of stuff like NFTs. We have great tools for verifying things like account balances. We have DePIN networks like Filecoin that let you verify stuff about the real world, but you have to build an entire protocol, right, in order to verify that. And we don't want to, every time we want to verify a new form of, something new in the real world, we don't want to have to spend the entire, 6-year R&D cycle to rebuild a protocol. And then we have decentralized oracles, which again are great if you have 100 different exchanges and people are voting on what the price of this token pair is, sort of on average across these exchanges, but don't work well if what you're trying to do is verify that a single tree was planted in this place, right? Or if you're trying to verify what my power bill was last month, it doesn't make sense to put that into a decentralized oracle. And so we've been thinking and reading a lot of the literature on actually how across society do we come to conclusions about these types of facts. And there's this work in sociology and political science on what's called an issue public. And the concept of an issue public is that you have these professional groups and people who are interested in some area, right? So like, for example, what should the methodology be around tree planting? Or if we want to plant 1 trillion trees, how are we going to get there? They deliberate on that. They learn a lot about that topic. They, often professionally do work in that area. Then once they've reached a conclusion, they signal that to the rest of society. And that's the rest of society says, okay, we know those people are doing a pretty good job on this. We trust them to figure it out. And there are these sort of informal ways in which that works across society, but we haven't scaled those for the internet, right? We don't actually have a trust architecture in online right now where we're able to verify this group of people, this community has reached a conclusion about how to do this particular, type of accounting, natural capital accounting, for example, and allowing that to sort of propagate through these systems. So that's what we're thinking, is that we have a lot of tools for validating certain types of information, but there are these gaps that we need to fill that have this shape, right? They have this shape of trust delegation from one community to another, and that's what we've been doing a lot of work building.
Awesome. Holke, jump in here. Where does Hypercerts fit into this conversation?
So Hypercerts in general is just a digital impact certificate. And so what we try to do with a Hypercert is create transparency around who did what, when. So, and that kind of layer can then be applied to kind of tree planting as an action. Who planted trees when, and then we can combine that with in that way, like issue publics who think about how to like evaluate the benefits of trees. And then if we combine that in a transparent way that is observable to everyone, then we can combine it with transparent flows of capital. So, and I think that infrastructure is something that we want to build, and that we want to build not only for one specific use case, but ideally that we build it and can be reused for different use cases. Because if it's tree planting, or if it is building open source software that is also can be seen as a public good, or if we do science research, all of those things are collective goods that create value, but they don't necessarily capture that value that they create themselves. So that's where we want to have a Hypercert that tells us who did what when, connect that with evaluators, and then basically connect that with funding mechanisms. And the infrastructure that we create is then something that Silvi can use and implement and really build kind of like the use case, one specific use case, because the general infrastructure is only useful if we have kind of organizations that really know what is necessary in a specific field, and then apply this more like generalized infrastructure to build out and interact with the stakeholders that are necessary to bring the impact to the ground where we need it.
Awesome. Okay, Djimo, help us make this real. Like, take us through the journey of tree, like from seedling or pre-seedling to and bring all these systems and paint us a picture of where this is going?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of layers to this onion, but I would start with there are 78,000 tree species, and we sort of need to bring precision agriculture to restoration, to reforestation, right? And so we need species and location-specific methodologies, to Alan's point. There's a lot of nuance, but all of this can be captured via sort of unique claim types or claim events. Examples would be proof of germination of a certain batch of seeds, and you could have fire-activated germination or cold stratified, or maybe even that species might need grafting if it's a commodity, like an avocado commodity. So all of this nuance can be captured in the methodology, but you certainly need sort of subject matter expertise to first create the methodology, and to also be able to evaluate impact through that lens. So I'm going to skip, I suppose, the economic side to how to financialize reforestation. Although I think it's extremely important from a Hypercerts perspective, because it opens the door to funding, to contribution, to delivering on that funding, and then to the transactioning or the exchange of that value, potentially to corporate offsetters, for example. But yeah, trees have a life cycle. It's a long life cycle. They outlive us, but usually statistical confidence can be achieved in year 5 or 6 of reforestation. Meaning, if trees have survived that long, more likely than not, the conditions are in place for them to survive. I would add that maybe the one condition here, caveat, is that there is climate adaptation needed, and so some thermal tolerances and sort of resilience limitations in trees might actually be pronounced 30, 40 years down the line. So I would say that's just maybe something beyond the 5 to 7 year mark, but even that can be referenced in said methodologies by experts. And so it's a matter of structuring all of this data in accordance to that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you though again, like explain it to me like I'm 5, but like so we run a farm in New Zealand. We're planting a lot of trees. Like right now, we call the nursery, we go, we pick up seedlings. We're kind of exploring our own in-house nursery, but right now we grab things that have already been germinated and grown for a bit, and the winter months roll around in New Zealand. We either hire contractors or do it ourselves. We plant native species and have kind of a broad strokes plan of what species are good around the waterways, referenced from, science and experts in Aotearoa in New Zealand. We plant them. Planters are not carrying around cell phones. They're carrying around cell phones in their pockets, but they're not actually taking pictures of every tree or scanning QR codes or anything like that.
Not
yet. We plant all the trees, and then maintenance is actually a big thing. Like when I first started doing this, I thought, you just plant a tree and you're done. But it turns out that there's more to it than that. We add up the totals of what we bought from the nursery. We keep kind of internal logs. We put that in our bookkeeping systems, and we pray for good weather for the next season so that the trees take, and we learn and we go. So 5 years from now, how might that look different as we build out all this infrastructure?
Yeah, well, first of all, I take out my hat to your work. You're amongst the very small minority of people engaged in this type of important work. I already have questions like this nursery. What type of genetics are they working with? How are they sourcing seeds? Do they know their mother trees? And are you timing the planting, optimally according to rain and all of that? So all of this can actually,
yes, is the answer.
Yeah, these methodologies are not just around impact verification, but they're effectively guidelines, so that anybody can participate. iNaturalist, it's a massively successful and important, with sort of species detection tools embedded and all of that, but it's produced millions and if not billions of readings and logs for butterflies and plants. And so it's a very successful citizen science movement. Pokemon Go is perhaps less scientific, but more on the gamification side of things. Also engaged millions, if not hundreds of millions of users. And so it's really about combining both of these sort of movements and opening, unlocking the sort of through participatory frameworks, 1 billion people. At least that's my opinion. I'm not saying you're providing jobs for 1 billion people, but potentially you are producing meaningful compensation for 100 million and lifting 10 million people out of poverty. But to your point, again, there's so many milestones behind a tree growing. Planting is, people assume planting is the main one. Yep. And certainly to some extent it is the most labor extensive. But there should be an entire sort of bonding structure and money escrow and milestone sort of verification process through that, and it should be supported by guides so that anybody participates. And you could plant the tree, but Alan could show up and verify 3 months later that it's alive, and Holke could do as well, a year later. And now all of a sudden that tree has actually 3 stewards, and you all get notified of its survival. So that's the vision, and yeah.
And it's so important.
Can I ask?
Please.
Can I ask 40% seriously, like what the Silvi.AR Pokemon Go tree planting game looks like, and does it involve Hypercerts? And how are the Hypercerts integrated?
We're not working with AR yet. I do believe that AR is it's a logical next step for effective mass MRV. So the dream would be to walk and monitor assets without having to point a phone and click a button. So we'll get there.
Well, you could see the Hypercerts for the stewards of this particular tree, next to that plant.
Yeah, but really the underlying architecture is important, and it's in 10 years, what we're doing today will feel primitive, but without this architecture, we will not sort of bullet out in AR, and so it might still be a little bit. Some activities might not be economically feasible, but they're certainly starting to piece the puzzle. And
so what's our customer journey with Silvi and these tools? So we're gonna pull out the app, and from day one, in terms of finding the methodology of what to plant, and then at each of these steps we're going to be attesting the activity and taking digital artifacts and pictures.
Basically, right now we have 2 types of methodologies: permissionless and permissioned methodologies. For permissioned, we're taking it very seriously. We are really optimally sort of engineering ecology around the Kakamega forest in Kenya. And there we're specifically defining the exact species we need and building out the logistics and the coordination around them. We're also vetting and onboarding users to enlist them in that methodology and geofencing the methodology to specific areas. So that's an example of very precise work that we are creating a bounty for. But there's, I think, a ton of opportunity in permissionless work as well. We're actually working with a corporate in Kenya to onboard Web3 users. And so the methodology in that case is very simple. It is proof of tree planting in Kenya, and proof of certain wallet provider. I can't speak yet to this client. But basically, if anybody would prove to plant a tree in Kenya, they would get compensated by this methodology. And my goal, my aim is that memetics and crowdsourcing can actually drive permissionless restoration faster than permissioned high friction restoration.
So I take a picture when I plant the tree, and then that goes into the application, and then I can somehow go get money for that? And just you bring up a new thing, which is if you don't have a score, we might ask you that you take a picture before and after planting with the same background to show. So I don't have trust yet established, so therefore I need to do the before and after.
Right. And trust can be established with a before and after, or it could be that you're creating a claim, but before your claim is settled and payable, someone with trust, like Holke, for example, might show up to your asset, verify your asset is actually there. And so now all of a sudden, Holke's trust is training your reputation score.
Got it. So after I do that planting and it's verified, is that when I get the Hypercert?
Once a claim is settled, it's verified. Again, the goal, I think, here is to build in machine scoring so that it's autonomous. But until then, we certainly need accredited committees. And I think this is sort of what Alan is really building tools for the evaluation frameworks around those attestations. Right now, we configure pools that prescribe methodologies, but then those specific methodologies need accredited badge holders or committees to verify that work. In legacy terms, this is the work of VVBs, verification and validation bodies, to a Vera or to an open forest protocol.
And basically, to chime in there with the Hypercert aspect that you asked about. So then when you do the work, you basically can create that Hypercert, but then it is evaluated by yourself, but also by this other trusted party that then, as Djimo explained, builds a reputation and builds out kind of this trust network. But in addition to that, what we really want to do then is kind of make sure that people feel they are in something bigger together, right? Because you can prove that you do work, but you also see other people doing work. And the work that you are doing could then inspire more people to also join in. And how do we make sure that not only you're doing something and we have all this mechanics in the background, but how do we bring that to the forefront? How do we inspire others and see, give recognition to those who did the work? So, and that is also the other kind of side of the Hypercert, that yes, we want to build kind of the decentralized database, but we also want to visualize it and give credit to the contributors who created the impact. So, and that is then what we call a hyperboard, which basically is a digital advertisement board that just shows who did the work. And in that way, work can be here kind of the non-financial aspect of planting a tree or other contributions, or it could also be the contribution in the financial sense. So, and both are oftentimes necessary. And how do we then just kind of build this prestige, this reputation in the open, and these people collectively planted these trees. And then you can kind of think of this as you stack it. You do it for a region, and people see, and it becomes kind of more movement, but it's a movement that is in that way data backed.
Right.
And I'm not sure if I have used it before, but a data-backed movement of tree planting or other things. Maybe that's an interesting concept to explore further, because then you do that in your village, in your region, in your country, but then you aggregate it on your continent, and you see maybe you're just this little tiny thing on the contribution to all the trees planted in your country,
right,
but you were part of it. And then it kind of is a different idea of how do we actually belong together? How do we do things together that can inspire change on a different level? And that is kind of the other part that we, I think, oftentimes forget when we talk about funding mechanisms and decentralized data systems and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because to really change something, we need to think about what do people care about, and how do we identify, see ourselves, see not only individual agency, but also collective agency to change what we really need to change. And if we can pull these things together and use kind of the scalable technology that we have, but do that in kind of a very human way, and then show how we kind of in that endeavor relate to each other, but also relate to nature, that is something that I think can then have effects beyond we build trees or planted trees, and bring us also closer together with each other.
Can I ask something about sort of that? I was talking to someone here from a nonprofit who said, I came to this conference to try to raise money because it's called Funding the Commons, and this seems like the place to do it. And I'm not sure how all of the things people are talking about like really impact our nonprofit that is already doing Web 2 stuff and trying to raise money from donors, but they nonprofits want more money in general. They're trying to look for sort of more streams to fund what they're doing. How should they think about using Hypercerts or Hyperboards to connect with more sources of funding?
So I think that is, if they want to reach out to new funders and get in that way, like expand their sources where they think they can tap into contributors that they haven't tapped into yet, then I think it's a combination of thinking about what are the funding structures behind it. So is it more crowdfunding? Is it reaching out to larger companies or foundations? And what do they really care about? Do they care about public visibility? Then like a hyperboard that shows them shows kind of their stakeholders. For example, if it's a company, the company cares about their stakeholders. And for those stakeholders, you create those hyperboards that shows what did this company contribute to. So then it's like in that way, really thinking through all kind of the needs of the stakeholders of this NGO. So from the NGO to the company, from the company to potentially the customers, and have that in a very transparent way and give credit where the credit kind of is needed to kind of advance this.
It's amazing. I mean, just all of these new things that are enabled by the underlying technologies around crypto blockchains, like, where credit is due, the verification aspect of this, the attestation, the decentralized nature of how we coordinate and organize. And I mean, all three of you are, in my mind, just, some of the foremost experts on crypto. Just at a high level, especially for people who are still new to the space and trying to understand it, like, yeah, how would you articulate some of the energy, the potential, where we're at in 2024, how these things are coming together, the conversations that you're hearing here at Funding the Commons and Earth Commons, any commentary from that prompt?
I think people have a sense that for the past couple of years, sort of since in late 2021, there was a lot of excitement about sort of the first generation of refi. People were taking a lot of off-chain carbon offsets and putting them on-chain. People were thinking about how we could use tokens and incentive mechanisms to really try to juice a lot of the basic infrastructure that had already been built in like generations of things like carbon markets.
Right.
And I think now I really get the sense that a lot of refi has sort of come into its own, where we're hearing much more about pilot projects that already exist that are totally Web3 native, right? Where like what you guys are doing with Silvi, Open Forest Protocol, Regen Network, Puro, everything Puro does is on a chain, right? So that's a big part of what I see is that there's a level of maturity that wasn't there before in a lot of these projects.
Yeah, it happened pretty quick. Yeah, fascinating. What about you guys?
I guess what I'm most excited about has been deployed mostly for open source software with retroactive public goods funding. But imagine a world where the signaling exists and people are doing good and restoring the planet. And perhaps with the help of Hypercerts, this impact and this data is captured. But then it can actually be bought out and in a retroactive way. Doesn't necessarily have to come from ecosystem growth grants, but can actually be sort of a marketplace phenomena. I'm quite excited for that.
Nice.
I think I would add to that what we have seen here are discussions around open source software, AI, and regeneration. So, and I think to some extent, they seem to be like separate topics, but they are intertwined so much. And really what we see is that the technology that has been around a couple of years now, we realize not only that we can do kind of old things better, but what are really the the native use cases of these technologies? How can we achieve a level of decentralization that is also shifting powers to the levels where the decisions really should be made? So when we think about regeneration, the decisions shouldn't be made on like a corporate level, on like national government level, because people on the ground really know what's happening. And how do we build kind of in that way the decentralized trust network that people on the ground are trusted with making the right decision, and then we plug that into our like really high level like satellite imagery measurement systems to check like, does it actually work or does it not work? And we can so much more seamlessly go from like this really large level to the low level and think about where do the decisions that we want to take really, like where are the people that really should make those decisions, and where are the kind of the measurements that we can give them to make better decisions, and not only to like build those mega incentive systems, but really just like provide the information for people to do their best work that they want to do, and give them also the trust to do that, and then collectively see what is the outcome of that. And I think that also brings us closer to not only tapping into kind of the sometimes kind of abstract incentives, but tapping into the knowledge systems that are on the ground and that are luckily still available for us to tap into. And kind of combining those very different elements and how we do that, I think that is something that I'm excited about, and excited that this conference brings all of these elements together so that we can have a dialogue about all these different elements, because like nobody is an expert in all of them together.
Yeah.
I think that's so crucial. And I'd say decentralization and self-correction or error correction sort of go hand in hand, right? And that I think that there's a framework or a set of frameworks that centralize decision-making. And along with that comes this idea that the methodology that this central organization came up with is unimpeachable, right? That like, that is how it's going to be done. We thought a lot about this. We're really smart. We're just going to like foist it on the rest of the world. And if you back away from that, and I think we're much more ready to fill this, right? To fulfill this role than I think we used to be as a refi community. If you back away from that, you're able to, like you said, sort of take knowledge and information from sources on the ground who have a lot of that knowledge and information, and from people who, you know, academics or other people who study these problems, and able to much more effectively make systems that sort of grow as you get new information about them. And so, for example, coming up with new methodologies, which you guys are doing a great job in building things in a way where those methodologies can be updated. We're also thinking a lot in Liquicert about how when you have these trust paths, one of the things that you can do is you can say, I trust this source of data. Another thing you can do is you can say, I actually believe that this group is a misinformer, right? They're wrong about this. And you can label data or other communities according to either of these, you know, either as trusted or not trusted. And what that means is that when you search for trust paths, you'll see the thumbs up ones, and you'll also see the thumbs down ones. And that gives you an opportunity to sort of use the conclusions along with the context around those conclusions to make better decisions over time.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I mean, you said it to me when we did our interview last year about a living ledger and these kinds of like living systems. My brother has been in my ear about like the scenario that blockchain is wildly, maximally successful beyond even what we imagine now, but the risks that, you know, we become chained to this system, you know, and all of this atomization and financialization and incentive mechanisms. And, you know, now the AI tells us to do this. And so we just blindly follow. And like, you know, how are we retaining that human agency and that local knowledge and these biocultural indicators? A different example that I've been grappling with is, you know, we're coming up with these totalizing scientific methodologies and metrics around biodiversity, for example. If you look at the landscape of New Zealand and you come up with a prescription for biodiversity, you might have a completely different answer to that question than what on the ground is really reflected in the importance of the kiwi bird. It's like our cultural identity. We will go far out of our way to protect the kiwi bird, to restore a forest, to hear the sounds of a kiwi. And it unlocks real funding flows in terms of our conservation efforts. And as a community that I'm a part of, we haven't heard kiwis in a long time. The kiwis have been mostly wiped out. And I'm finding that one of the bridge building messages and narratives that's being echoed back is like, wouldn't it be amazing if we could hear the sound of the kiwis in the forest again? And that's rallying people to get excited about conservation. But like, if some lab in Europe tells me that, that doesn't matter, and that's what's required to unlock this certificate, to get this funding flow, like, so yeah, I'm curious what that prompts for you guys and any practical ways that you're thinking about addressing these types of problems to ensure that kind of local agency and cultural know-how.
Yeah, and whether it's the kiwi in New Zealand or the jaguar in South America, I think there are these really symbolic and important indigenous brands, if I may use that term, that are important to consider, but also to bridge, the conversation with local stakeholders. I think Regen Network is really pioneering.
We had a great conversation with Gregory Anatosa about the Jaguar biocultural credits pilot. Yeah.
Yeah, and the ecological benefit framework is also really considering this element beyond sort of the abiotic pieces out there. So yeah, and methodologies are just ultimately tools, and I think methodologies should be informed by indigenous knowledge. When we work in Kenya, we're actually not, where there's a very conscious intention not to come in a colonial way, but to really learn and to identify community experts, leaders, many of whom have a true understanding of their biome, and to empower them simply.
Nice. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
For me, it relates to kind of these really large layer that sometimes creates like incentives from, as you say, to some extent, somebody in Europe said like, oh, you should do this or that. And I think there's the importance of boundaries, for example, around the bioregion, where really that bioregion takes care of itself. And like the people in there that are connected to the land have the resources and the trust to do their work. And if they need funding from outside, then that doesn't define and decide exactly what needs to be done. But it trusts the people on the ground, and so it's more that it's almost like relational capital. So it's like it's like the capital is deployed to the bioregion with the trust that they will do the right thing, and it's not just tied to the exact outcome that we measure with scientific measurements. But at the same time, we still use the measurements to inform the decision makers. So it's like it's not that we're giving up on measurements, especially because we can measure so much more, and like it's like such an advancement. But we use that in combination with the trust that people on the ground know what they are doing. And so I think that is then at some point kind of a nested governance system where funding flows potentially from multiple stages, where it flows down because that's where the trust is established between one organization, a really large organization, to smaller ones, till it reaches really the decision makers on the ground. And as much as we can do that with low transaction costs, so that this flow is not just like not everybody takes 10% of that flow, but it really flows quite easily through those systems, then we can build a system where everybody is empowered in a decentralized way, and that knowledge is really like taking into account, and we don't have the kind of dystopian view of there's like some centralized like measurement system that defines suddenly everything, because that is not what we are trying to build. And that is, I think, like the last point that I'm making here. It is extremely important what kind of defaults and design decisions we are making now when we build this technology, because this technology now will define what is possible in the future. And it is potentially really difficult to change those defaults in the future when we have established more of these systems.
Mm. Yeah, and Alan, you and I had spoken about that last year, about that point of, reducing the friction between these layers, also on the verifiability, since, a lot of supply chain reporting, for example, you have, annual reporting and different systems and PDFs and all stacking. And so we're not getting real-time transparency, visibility, understanding. And that's one of the value propositions that blockchains offers. But yeah, could you say more?
Yeah, and I think your story about the Kiwi and that being such a cultural touchstone made me think of a few things. One of them was Silent Spring and sort of the origins of the modern environmental movement.
Mm-hmm.
Really were not connected to these sort of global trends around biodiversity collapse that
Right.
is sort of a vacuum, sort of an abstract thing to a lot of people, or climate change, but around, in your local stream, what are you going to hear when you go outside, right? As a result of the decisions that we make. I think a paper came out recently showing that during COVID lockdown, you would expect people's life expectancy to decrease in areas that were hit hard because of less economic activity, but actually their lifespans increased. I think it was something like for every 2% of economic of reduced economic activity, people's lifespans increased or life expectancy increased by about 1%. I think that was the number.
Wow.
And they dug into why, and they found it was because of pollution from cars and factories and power plants.
Yeah.
And that local environmental pollution really affects people. And so maybe if we're going to inspire people to take action, we do need to relate these large concepts to things like, okay, maybe you should electrify your house. Not necessarily because of climate change, but because gas stoves could give your kids asthma. Maybe we should decarbonize cars, because of climate change, but also because of local pollution. And same thing for the whole sort of fossil fuel economy.
Yeah.
And like Holke was saying, I think that's a big part of the role that we can really play is we can take the impact that people are having and really give it context, and especially local context, so that people can think about large trends and relate their impact to those large trends if they want to, but also get really narrow and specific and show how what we are doing touches people's lives.
Just to anchor on that, I mean, I think really the big theme of Web3, to your earlier question, is data interoperability and being able to aggregate knowledge. And so whether it's cultural attributes or scientific rigor, it's just vital and really, really important to continue building out this sort of potentially semantic web, but at least sort of these knowledge graphs. To accomplish the trillion trees, we certainly need a tree knowledge graph and sort of a tree intelligence commons. We are working on Wikipedia, but it's not us. It's really meant to be for everybody. But yeah, I thought I would follow up on that.
Wikipedia, I love it. And I've heard you also refer to it as WebTree.
WebTree is a campaign at the intersection of reforestation and Web3. Wikipedia is the tree intelligence commons, and then Open Trees is the tree data standard.
Great. Final question. Much respect, by the way, just for all the work that you guys are doing. Very much appreciating it. When you wake up on Monday morning, tomorrow, what are the key challenges top of mind? April 2024, like what are the roadblocks, the hurdles? What are you trying to iron out? Let's start with you, Alan.
We're thinking a lot about how to bring that context to claims. And so I think, on Monday, what I'm going to be thinking about is developing the set of products that we're spinning out of Protocol Labs into Devonian systems. But I think on the broader scale, it's really a lot of what we've been talking about, right? How do we take the impact that we're trying to have and connect that to sources of capital and funding that are really going to allow it to scale?
Nice.
I think for me, it would be two main points. The first one being that how to really build an interconnected funding network so that multiple platforms use the same decentralized database and evaluations so that we don't duplicate the work. So how do we integrate this into as many funding platforms as possible? So that's like a very practical thing. And then I think the second one is a little bit like on the larger picture. How do we not just see these funding systems as purely transactional, but bring back kind of the relationality into the funding systems, because they define so much what people do, and can we design them in a more like relational way? And I think that is a bigger challenge that we have, because the systems tend to automatically go to the numbers and the incentives, and we easily forget the relationality. And bringing that back in is, I think, like a challenge that we all have. And so I think it's one of the first one was more like the operational that I think about, and then the second one is more like the meta question that we have to tackle together.
Well, we certainly have our day-to-day sort of operational challenges, but I think the existential challenge I'm facing right now is, Silvi's 2 years old. We've received 12 grants. We haven't fundraised yet. And at some point, we really need to accelerate. But is it possible, perhaps, to underwrite the Silvi protocol via natural capital funding, so via the financing of reforestation itself? And what is the relationship between that funding stream and governance in Silvi protocol? So this is sort of what occupies my days. We're producing a white paper around this concept of trees as an ideal asset class for natural capital, but to raise or not to raise.
Yeah. Well, I'm really. I think it's so important that we have these examples that get set that really bend the paradigm and the playbook. And I know it's not a comfortable position to be in, but I think you are quickly embodying, this kind of proof point of what Web3 can do in terms of grants funding at the early stages, instead of just the traditional VC playbook. And so we will be watching your journey with keen interest, Djimo. Any closing comments or closing thoughts from you guys? Any thoughts also on Funding the Commons, Earth Commons, the event we're at, Protocol Labs? I mean, you guys both spun out of Protocol Labs. I want to give a shout out to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we started SBS. So we started the Sustainable Blockchain Summit in early 2022 and did several renditions of that. And as Protocol Labs is spinning everything out, we sort of gave SBS to Funding the Commons as Commons.Earth. And it's, for me, it's been amazing to see sort of the intersection of the two communities. And that's exactly what we hoped, was that the public goods funding on one side and the sort of sustainability refi stuff on the other side would really meld together and buttress each other. Because I think there's a huge amount of understanding from public goods folks that they want to proceed in a way that's sustainable and both learn from and contribute to the environmental movement. And, likewise on the other side.
Yeah, your babies are becoming toddlers.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would add a shout out to you and the team behind, because I think it's really cool to have the stage to share more of these ideas, that you bring us together to have this conversation in public, and because I think it is so much larger than what any one of us or even we together can achieve. So getting the word out and your work on this is crucial. So thanks for that.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, Holke beat me to it. I really think you have an interesting and just spectacular platform, and especially sort of, this podcast setting, I think really conveys important messages. I want to thank Protocol Labs for being one of our grant providers, and I want to express my excitement to work with Hypercerts.
Yeah, likewise. Very excited to be with all of you guys. Thanks so much. Also paying our respect and gratitude to Protocol Labs. This is our final behind the scenes upstairs in this little makeshift office space session at the Funding the Commons and Earth Commons events here at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. Also, while we're on the acknowledgments and shout outs, I want to pay some respect to people who don't get named nearly enough. Behind this camera right here, David Frank, and behind the camera over to my right, Jeff Kulig, both from Royster Productions, doing the media and setting the scene for us to have these discussions. Also, shout outs to Yael Morantz, Ty Kenning, Hans Valor, Billy Lewis, Story Shapers, the many different threads that are weaving together to make this Ma-Earth Network media production possible. We are also looking for more collaborators and media makers, storytellers, educators, people in this space excited about these conversations. So if you've made it this far in this discussion, you might be interested, please reach out. We're going to be running a grants round next week when you're watching this, maearth.com/grants. Throwing our hat in the ring on quadratic funding, putting up a matching pool for regenerative land projects. And hopefully we'll see Silvi on the platform as well. But anyway, thanks so much. Links are in the show notes to all of these projects. Check out maearth.com, subscribe, like, share, tell your friends, and we'll see you on the next one.